The transport smelled like recycled air and someone else's decisions. Marta Voss-Okafor had been breathing recycled air for 22 years of interstellar contracting, and she had developed, over that time, the specific skill of identifying exactly whose decisions had gone wrong based on the particular chemical signature of the recycled air she was currently breathing. This transport smelled like procurement had gone with the lowest bidder atmospheric scrubbers, and someone in station logistics had decided to save on filtration cycling. It was the smell of institutional cost-cutting made atmospheric. She knew it well. She had breathed it on 11 different stations in 4 different systems, and she had been breathing it in one form or another since she was 22 years old and reporting for duty to the Polish Navy's engineering division in Gdynia with new boots that hadn't yet decided whether or not they were going to cooperate. She sat in the 3rd row of the personnel transport with her kit bag between her feet and her diagnostic satchel on her lap, and she looked out the narrow viewport at Crucible Station 9 and thought, yes, this is exactly what a place called Crucible Station 9 looks like. The station was Veth Consortium architecture, which meant it was clean in the way that very expensive things are clean. Not scrubbed clean, not worked over clean, but clean the way something is clean when dirt has never been permitted to approach it. All hard angles and pale composite surfaces, humming at a frequency that Marta had noticed as soon as the transport had entered docking range, a low subharmonic that wasn't quite a sound so much as a fact about the air. She could feel it in her back teeth. She had a colleague, former colleague before Kepler Helix got absorbed and everyone's contracts became someone else's legal problem, who would have called it the frequency of being told you're not good enough. Marta would not have said that. Marta would have said it was the resonance signature of Veth harmonic systems operating at near idle, which was accurate and had the advantage of not making her sound bitter. She wasn't bitter. She had spent considerable energy in the last 14 months deciding not to be bitter, and she felt that the decision was holding mostly. Piotr was asleep in the seat next to her, which was something she had come to understand as simply a feature of Piotr. He was 24 and from Warsaw, and he had the specific talent of falling asleep in any vehicle that was moving, the way cats find sunlight. He had been her apprentice for 3 years, and she had spent those 3 years being surprised repeatedly by how much he actually knew, as opposed to how much he was pretending to know, which she had initially assumed was the whole of it. She had been wrong. He knew a great deal. He simply applied it with the casual confidence of someone who had not yet had enough things go badly wrong to be properly cautious, and Marta tried, when she remembered, to be patient about this. Darla was sitting 2 rows back and looking at everything with the focused attention of a 19-year-old Eresi on her first off-world contract, which meant she was looking at everything as if it might be on a test she hadn't yet been told about. The Eresi were small and ochre-skinned and had 3-chambered respiratory systems and the most precise spatial memory of any species Marta had worked alongside, which made them extraordinary at 3-dimensional diagnostics and made Darla specifically very useful in the kind of tight space assessment work that tended to come with old ships and nobody's business engineering. She had been nervous for the whole journey. Marta respected this. Nervousness in her experience was just respect for the job expressed through the body. Sen was standing at the front of the cabin, talking to the transport operator about something Marta couldn't hear over the engine noise. He was Conclave, blue-grey skin, tall, the slightly formal carriage of someone who had been educated by a succession of institutions that took their own seriousness very seriously. He was 26 years old and had a graduate certification in structural antiquities analysis and had spent, as far as Marta could determine, approximately 0 days of his career outside of clean, well-lit rooms, examining scans of things rather than the things themselves. He was here because the Conclave had required an independent structural analyst on the assessment team, and he was here because the Avarath was 4,000 years old. And something about that number had clearly made him feel things he was trying very hard not to display. The transport locked into the docking cradle with a clunk that woke Piotr instantly. "Are we there?" he said. "No," Marta said. "We're in the void between all destinations, floating forever." "Right," Piotr said, and began looking for his bag. The contractor intake bay was cold and white, and staffed by 2 Veth processing clerks, who had the look of individuals who had been told that efficiency was a virtue and had taken this to mean that all other virtues were optional. They scanned Marta's credentials with a device that emitted a small chime with each successful read, like applause for paperwork. They issued her a contractor badge without looking at her directly, which was fine. She had not come here for eye contact. The badge listed species Terran human, classification senior propulsion technician physical manual track, employer Kepler Helix Maintenance Solutions, subsidiary Veth Consortium acquisition 7 of 19, computational efficiency rating 0.34 manually augmented. Marta looked at the badge for a moment. She had a 0.34 computational efficiency rating. She had been awarded by machines that had never watched her work, the specific rating of someone who was almost useful, but mostly just present. She put the badge on. It was the same shade of pale grey as everything else on Crucible Station 9, and it had a small light on the edge that blinked blue to indicate she was a biological entity in a space where biological entities required monitoring. She had seen worse paperwork. She had in fact seen paperwork that had ended her retirement. This was just paperwork that insulted her. The relative ranking was clear. The briefing room was on level 4 of the administrative spoke, which meant a 7-minute walk through corridors that hummed and glowed and were spotlessly, aggressively clean. There were no scratches on these walls, Marta noted, no scuff marks on the floor from equipment trolleys, no worn patches near the corners where people habitually put their hands for balance. Either the station was very new, or the Veth Consortium employed an extraordinary number of surface maintenance staff, and given what she knew about Veth operational philosophy, she suspected the former. They built things clean and then replaced them rather than maintain them, which was a philosophy she found simultaneously understandable and faintly tragic. Administrator Avarath was already in the briefing room when they arrived, standing at the head of the table in the way that people stand when they have been waiting and want you to know it. He was Dasari, the species that had evolved advanced mathematics before they evolved language, which Marta had always found remarkable and slightly exhausting in practice, since it meant that Dasari processed social information in the same way they processed equations, which made them simultaneously very precise and very impatient with ambiguity. He was tall, with the blue-silver complexion of a mature Dasari adult, and he had the particular expression of someone doing the arithmetic of whether the people in front of him were worth the time the arithmetic would take. The Kepler Helix assessment team, he said, not as a greeting but as an identification. He looked at the badge Marta was wearing. Senior Propulsion Technician Voss-Okafor, your team is smaller than the manifest indicated. 2 additional crew are still in medical clearance, Marta said. Atmospheric sensitivity check, they'll clear in an hour. The Avarath produces breathable atmosphere for 67 species. It is not a hazardous environment. Medical clearance is protocol, Marta said. Protocol exists because something at some point went wrong without it. Avarath looked at her for the specific length of time that indicated he was deciding not to argue about this, and then he began the briefing. The Avarath, he explained, had been found drifting in the Kerath expanse approximately 340 years ago by a Conclave survey vessel. At that point it was already old enough that no living civilization could identify its builders. The ship's own records were encoded in a language that shared structural ancestry with 14 modern languages, suggesting its builders were either proto-ancestors of existing species or had significantly influenced their linguistic development. But the specific civilization had left no other archaeological record. They had built one ship, apparently. Or they had built more and only one survived. The Conclave did not know which, and this uncertainty, Marta noted, was delivered by Avarath with the specific discomfort of someone who found not knowing to be a personally offensive condition. 11 separate empires, confederacies, and governing bodies had attempted to claim the Avarath over 4 centuries. All had failed. The failure mode was consistent. Boarding teams were permitted entry without resistance. All interface attempts with the ship's systems failed, and after periods ranging from a few hours to a maximum of 71 hours, the atmosphere within the ship became subtly but definitively unpleasant. Not toxic, not dangerous, simply wrong in the particular way of air in a place that would prefer you to leave. All 11 boarding teams had eventually left. Several had left certain that the ship was cursed. Several others had left certain that the ship's AI required a specific harmonic authorization code that hadn't been found yet. The Conclave's current theoretical consensus was the latter. The Veth Consortium had tried every known harmonic authorization pattern in their library. The ship had not responded. The Consortium's current plan was to dismantle the Avarath for components, a vessel 4 millennia old that still produced its own atmosphere and had a functional power core, and intact electromagnetic rail systems was worth, in parts, more than most inhabited moons. They had brought in Kepler Helix because dismantling alien machinery required the kind of physical engagement with actual components that the Veth Consortium staff, Sane Forath explained, were not trained for. Terran laborers, he said, and the pause before the sentence was the specific pause of someone choosing their words very carefully, in a way that did not indicate particular care for the words they landed on, are assigned to physical assessment because their species has not yet developed sufficient computational integration to interface with standard systems. Think of them as very precise biological sensors. Nobody said anything for a moment. Piotr, next to Marta, was doing the thing where his jaw went very slightly tight, which was how Marta had learned to read that Piotr was angry. Darla was looking at the table. Sen, the structural analyst, had the expression of someone who was deciding whether what had just been said was insulting or merely clinical, and had concluded that the question was probably academic. "That's very kind," Marta said. "When can we board?" She boarded alone first. This was against protocol. The protocol, as written by Kepler Helix's assessment division, required all team members to enter a new assessment environment together, following a safety sweep by the highest senior technician, which was Marta, which meant she was required to conduct the safety sweep and then wait for the others, which was in practice approximately what she was doing, except for the waiting part. She had simply decided that the safety sweep would take longer than standard, and that the rest of the team could board when she radioed clearance. She hadn't told them this plan. They were setting up equipment on the docking platform. She had walked through the boarding connector, and then she had walked onto the Avarath, and then she was inside. She stopped walking. She had been inside a lot of ships. She had been inside ships that were new and ships that were old, and ships that smelled like industry, and ships that smelled like desperation, and ships that smelled like whatever cleaning product the last crew had used too much of. She had been inside 3 ships that she would describe as beautiful, meaning that they had a quality of engineering that was legible to her in a way that felt closer to aesthetics than function, a rightness about them that she could not fully articulate but could recognize immediately. The Avarath was the 4th. She stood in the entrance corridor and looked at it and understood, without being able to say exactly why yet, that this ship had been built by people who understood what they were building. Not just engineered, understood. The proportions of the corridor were slightly off from standard Conclave design, slightly taller and narrower, but they resolved into something that felt correct in the way that good design feels correct, invisibly, until you started looking for why. The walls were a material she didn't immediately recognize, dark and faintly textured, and they ran warm under her fingertips when she touched them, not the warmth of an active system, but the residual warmth of a system that had been running at very low output for a very long time. Like touching the side of a boiler that's been banked down but not out. She walked. She walked for 20 minutes in near silence, deeper into the ship, through corridors that branched and spiraled in a layout that was not intuitive by any standard she'd encountered, but that she was already beginning to read, the way you learn to read a new building by moving through it until the logic reveals itself. The electromagnetic rail system ran along the ceiling. She recognized the induction strips, wider than she'd expected, the engineering choice of a civilization that had planned for heavy equipment transport. The thermal exchange conduits ran, along the lower walls behind panels, but she could see where they ran from the pattern of the fasteners and from the specific quality of warmth in some sections of wall versus others. The atmospheric processes were distributed. She counted 7 exchange nodes in the first 200 meters, and they were running. Very quietly, very minimally, but running. The air on the Avarath was old clean, the way air in a sealed and carefully maintained space is clean. Not processed clean, cared for clean. She came to a junction and stopped. The ship made a sound. It was not an alarm. It was not a weapon. It was not any of the things that 4,000 years of failed boarding reports would have suggested a ship might produce in the presence of an unauthorized visitor. It was a sound like a diesel engine turning over on a cold morning. The specific, careful sound of a machine that wants to start, but is assessing whether this is a good idea. Marta had heard that sound so many times in her life that it lived in her somewhere below conscious thought, in the place where her body kept the things it had learned before her mind had words for them. She stood very still. She put her left hand flat against the wall. The wall was warm under her palm, and she could feel, very faintly, through the reduced sensation of her nerve-damaged hand, which meant the vibration was strong enough to read through what was essentially a numbed surface, a resonance, not random vibration, structured resonance. The wall was talking to anyone who knew how to listen, and it was saying something about pressure and flow and a specific mechanical resistance somewhere in a system she hadn't found yet. She knew that feeling. She knew it the way she knew her own face. She had spent 30 years with her hands on machines that were trying to tell her what was wrong with them, and the Avarath was trying to tell her what was wrong with it. Marta Voss-Okafor, 51 years old, standing in the corridor of a 4,000-year-old alien starship with a contractor's badge that gave her a 0.34 computational efficiency rating, looked at the wall and said out loud to the empty corridor, "All right then, what's broken?" Administrator Avarath boarded at the 4-hour mark. This was, he made clear from the moment of his entry, an inspection. He had received a transmission from Marta's contractor badge communicator indicating that the safety sweep was ongoing, which was technically not a false statement, but was, he suspected, something other than the complete truth. He had come to establish what the complete truth was. He found it in the main thermal exchange corridor, which ran along the port side of the ship's lower engineering level. Marta was sitting cross-legged on the deck. Her boots were off, her socks were off. Her bare feet were flat against the deck plating, and she was very still, in the way that she was still when she was listening to something she couldn't yet hear clearly enough. Her diagnostic satchel was open next to her. Her Klein Tools multimeter was running a continuous read on the EM output from the nearest conduit junction. She had 3M electrical tape flags marking 6 separate points on the wall panels, blue for observed thermal variance, red for suspected resonance nodes, yellow for what she had labeled in her own shorthand as Avarath looked at the bare feet. He looked at the tape flags. He looked at the woman sitting on the floor of an irreplaceable pre-conclave vessel with no shoes on. "You are contaminating a priceless artifact," he said, "with your biological residue." Marta did not open her eyes immediately. When she did open them, she did not seem startled. The ship has an internal atmospheric composition that includes trace biological markers from 47 species across 11 boarding teams across 4 centuries, she said. "My foot cells are not the threat model here. This methodology has a pressure differential," Marta said, "in the secondary thermal exchange loop, right there." She pointed at the wall without looking at it. "The exchange fluid, it's a mineral oil analog, I can smell it in the joints, is moving at roughly 60% of capacity in this section relative to the section I was in 40 minutes ago. You can feel it through the deck if you take your shoes off and pay attention." Avarath had no intention of taking his shoes off. The ship's systems had been assessed computationally by 17 separate engineering teams. "They were trying to talk to the computer," Marta said, standing. She picked up her satchel without hurry and began taking out her torch. They weren't checking the plumbing. The Rothenberger Super Fire 3 was 11 years old and had been rebuilt twice, and had a small scratch on the handle where Marta had caught it on a conduit edge in a Gdansk naval engineering bay in 2031, and it was the most reliably useful tool she owned because she knew exactly what it would do and exactly how to make it do what she needed, which was more than she could say for most things. She lit it, adjusted the flame to the precise size she wanted, and began working along the thermal exchange conduit joints. She was not applying heat directly. She was applying heat adjacent to the joints, to the expansion interface between the conduit material and the panel housing, watching for the specific quality of discoloration that would tell her about the thermal conductivity of the material at that interface. She had learned this technique from a man named Józef Kwiatkowski in a naval engineering bay 30 years ago, and she had used it on ship systems that ranged from Polish Navy engineering to Conclave standard reactors. And it had never stopped working because thermal expansion and material conductivity didn't care about the civilization that had designed the system. Physics was rude that way, the Avarath responded. It was subtle. It would have been easy to miss. In the corridor where Marta was working, with Administrator Zane Forath standing by the entrance and looking at her with an expression that mixed professional disapproval with the specific discomfort of someone who was beginning to suspect they might be wrong about something, the lights shifted. Not dramatically, not with the quality of a system responding to a command. The lights in the thermal exchange corridor shifted fractionally warmer, the specific warm white of a system moving from minimum safe maintenance output to something approaching operational calibration. Marta noticed. She didn't say anything, she kept working. She made a small private note in her diagnostic log. Ship noticed. Good. Zane Forath noticed that she had noticed something, because he was a Dasari, and precision was his native language, and he had been watching her face. What was that? He said. The lights shifted, Marta said. Why? Because I touched the right place, Marta said. Go check your sensors. The power output from the core just changed. He checked his sensors. He checked them with the expression of someone who is deeply reluctant to find what they suspect they are about to find. Then he was quiet for a moment. Fractionally, he said. Yes, Marta said. Fractionally. But you've been trying for months and gotten nothing. I've had 4 hours and gotten fractionally. I'm going to find what's broken. From the docking platform, 40 minutes later, Zane Forath opened a channel to his direct superior, Administrator Primary Thessandol, at Veth Consortium Operational Headquarters. The Terran laborer, he said, and there was a quality to his voice that was not quite anything that could be specifically identified, but that was, in a person who had evolved mathematics before language, the closest approximation to the word bewildered, is performing tactile assessment of interior systems. She has removed her footwear and is pressing her bare feet against the deck plating to measure vibration. She is using what appears to be a heating implement of Terran manufacture. I want to log formally that I find this methodology aesthetically and procedurally unacceptable, and I believe we should establish a minimum computational threshold before... Does it seem to be working? Thessandol's voice was the tone of someone who had overseen a great deal of failed operations and had developed, as a result, a functional pragmatism about methodology. Zane Forath paused. A Dasari pause, which meant the arithmetic was running. Define working, he said. She found it in the 3rd hour after Zane Forath had boarded. She told her crew before she told Zane Forath. She gathered them in the thermal exchange corridor. Piotr with his arms crossed and his jaw doing the tight thing again. Darla with her field scanner already running. Sen with his recording tablet and the expression of someone trying to be professionally neutral about something that was making him feel a great deal. The ship isn't locked, Marta said. It isn't selective. It isn't running a security protocol that nobody's cracked. It has a stuck valve. She showed them. On the wall where her red tape flags had been migrating for 3 hours, she had pulled the panel. The Avarath had allowed this, which was itself informative. The panel access points were designed to be opened, which meant the builders had intended maintenance access, which meant they had expected that the ship would need tending, and exposed the thermal exchange valve assembly. It was a masterwork of engineering from 4,000 years ago. She could see that immediately, the way you can see quality in old things, the elegance of design that has been tested against actual function and refined until nothing unnecessary remains. A valve assembly for a mineral oil analog thermal exchange system designed to regulate flow between the primary and secondary thermal loops. And it was stuck. The valve itself was not broken. The mechanism was not corroded. The control actuation was fine. The valve was stuck because the sealing compound around the adjustment collar, a compound the ship's builders had used to create a fluid-tight interface between the moving valve body and the fixed housing, had over 4,000 years of cyclic thermal expansion and contraction and chemical aging, polymerized. It had turned into petrified resin. Beautiful, alien, 4,000-year-old petrified resin, sealing a valve in the three-quarters closed position, and the ship's power core, a still active, still functional, extraordinary power core, had been running at minimum safe output for 4,000 years. Because the ship's own regulatory systems, which were working perfectly, had detected a thermal exchange imbalance and had throttled the core to prevent damage. The Avarath had not been rejecting anyone. The Avarath had been sick. The Avarath had been protecting itself, doing what any sensible system does when it detects an imbalance, reducing load to prevent catastrophic failure. It had been managing its own illness for 4,000 years, waiting for someone who could hear what it was saying. It had been making the atmosphere unpleasant in the end, not as a weapon, as a symptom, the way a sick organism's environment becomes uncomfortable as a secondary effect of the illness itself. "It's been trying to tell them," Dala said. Her voice was very quiet. She had the specific expression that Iresi had when a circulatory metaphor landed perfectly, because the Iresi had something biologically analogous to this. Their own primary circulatory analog had a valve structure, and blockage was the leading cause of death in her species, and she had grown up understanding viscerally what it meant for flow to be obstructed. Every ship that came, it was already sick, and they were trying to talk to it instead of asking where it hurt, Marta said. Zen was very still. He had pulled up his research tablet and was scrolling through something, and Marta could see from his face that what he was reading was changing him, specifically and visibly, in the way that actual revelation, not intellectual discovery, but the kind of discovery that requires you to revise a long-held structural assumption, changes a person. "Every recorded boarding," he said, "all 11 attempts, they all began after the 3rd century of the ship's dormancy. The earliest record of the Avarath's power output before the dormancy," he stopped, started again. "It was significantly higher. The valve failure must have occurred in the 3rd century. Every empire tried to claim a ship that had been running on emergency minimum power for 400 years by the time anyone found it." "They thought they were trying to start a ship," Piotr said. He had uncrossed his arms. "They were trying to start a ship that was already running as hard as it could." "Yes," Marta said, "and nobody ever just looked at the plumbing." "They were trying to talk to the computer," Marta said. "The computer didn't know the answer. The computer knew the ship was sick and was compensating accordingly. Nobody asked the plumbing. The problem with the valve assembly was the compound." Marta had known this was coming. You could unstick a valve with mechanical force. She had done it many times in many different contexts, but mechanical force on a 4,000-year-old sealing compound that had polymerized into something approaching rock would risk fracturing the valve body itself, and a fractured valve body on a thermal exchange system that was about to be brought to full power was a category of problem she was not interested in creating. Modern conclave solvents would not work. She knew this without testing it, because modern conclave solvents were designed for harmonic-era materials, polymer structures that had been engineered to specific chemical tolerances, which meant their dissolution chemistry was narrow and precise. A 4,000-year-old alien polymer compound that had been undergoing continuous chemical aging was outside those tolerances. The conclave's tools were too sophisticated for this problem. They had optimized for materials they could predict and were helpless in front of materials they couldn't. Marta went through her kit. She had acetone, standard hardware store-grade acetone, which she kept for cleaning valve surfaces and dissolving residue from gasket material on old Earth-derived equipment. She had isopropyl alcohol at 70% from the crew medical kit, because she had once needed to clean a sensor housing on a ship where the only cleaning agent available was the medical kit, and since then she had never gone anywhere without making sure the medical kit was fully stocked with isopropyl, and she had her torch. She thought about the problem. She thought about what she knew about polymer degradation chemistry, which was not advanced. She was a propulsion technician, not a materials scientist, but was practical. Aged polymerized compounds typically had two vulnerabilities: thermal cycling, which could create microfractures in the polymer structure by differential expansion, and solvent penetration at those microfractures, which could work its way into the structure and break the polymer chains from the inside. She thought about Józef Kwiatkowski, who had taught her about thermal cycling. She thought about the Gdansk shipyards, where she had spent her childhood weekends watching her father work the cranes and listening to the old mechanics talk about fixing things that were technically beyond fixing. She thought about the boiler room in Gdynia, where she had spent 3 weeks on a pump that 17 engineers had declared irreparable, and she thought about how she had fixed it, which was by asking it systematically what was wrong, and following the answer where it led. She mixed the acetone and the isopropyl in the ratio she wanted. She applied the mixture to the valve collar with a brush from her kit, working it into every accessible surface joint. She waited 20 minutes for penetration. Then she applied careful, brief heat from the torch to the valve housing, not to the collar itself, to the housing, warming the metal around the compound to open the microstructure. And then she applied more solvent, and she waited, and she repeated this, and she was on the 4th cycle when the mixture of earth chemistry and patience, and the specific understanding that broken is broken, regardless of what civilization did, the breaking began to work. The compound was softening, not dissolving, aging too thoroughly for that, but softening. The polymer chains that had been rigid for centuries were moving, very slightly, but moving. She radioed the crew. "Get ready," she said, "but stay back. I don't know what the power-up is going to feel like." "Ready for what?" Piotr said. "For the ship," Marta said. From Crucible Station 9 sensor bay, Administrator Saint Avarath had been watching the camera feed in the thermal exchange corridor for the last 2 hours. He had watched Marta apply, remove, and reapply substances from her kit to an alien valve assembly with the patient precision of a person who was not in a hurry because they understood what they were doing. He had pulled the records on her kit's contents and identified the substances, and had then sat for a long moment processing what he was seeing. He opened a channel to Administrator Primary Thessendol. "The Terran," he said, "is dissolving the valve seal with... I'm checking the compound, cleaning fluid and medical antiseptic. She's using a hand torch. I don't know how to classify this in the report. The closest category I have is unauthorized primitive chemical intervention." There was a pause on the channel. "Keep watching," Thessendol said. Her voice had changed slightly. It had the quality of a person who has been doing arithmetic and has arrived at a result that requires them to revise a premise. When the valve moved, Marta felt it through the handle of the tool she was using to work it. A simple manual actuator from her kit, the kind of thing you use to operate valves in spaces too tight for power tools, a manual tool. She had heard at the briefing that the Veth Consortium found the concept of a human putting her hands inside a reactor manifold somewhere between primitive and obscene. She thought about this briefly while she worked the valve back and forth with the actuator, feeling the compound break its grip in increments, and she thought that there was a perspective from which the willingness to put your hands inside a thing and understand it from the inside was not primitive, but simply different, simply the recognition that some problems required you to be inside them to see them clearly. The valve came free. The compound cracked at 3 points simultaneously as the valve finally rotated through its full range, and the crack was audible, a small, sharp sound in the corridor, like a knuckle popping. And then the valve was open, fully open. For the first time in what the engineering logs would later calculate to be 3,147 years, the exchange fluid began to move. Marta could feel it through the conduit wall, a change in the quality of vibration, a deepening, a richness, like a pulse returning to a vein that had been compressed. The thermal exchange loop was circulating. The secondary thermal loop was receiving flow for the first time in nearly 4 millennia. And the Avarath woke up, not gradually, not with the slow escalation of a system powering up through controlled stages. The Avarath woke up the way a living thing wakes up when the thing that was wrong with it is corrected, completely and all at once, every corridor illuminated. Not the minimum maintenance ambient glow that had been running for 4 centuries of failed boarding attempts, but full illumination, warm and precise and directional, the light of a ship that knew what it was doing and was doing it. The electromagnetic rail system came online with a sound like a chord, multiple frequencies resolving into something that was almost musical, the specific resonance of properly powered induction systems achieving calibration. The atmospheric processes shifted from minimum output to full operational cycling, and the air on the Avarath changed. It became cleaner in a way that Marta registered physically, the way you register the change in air quality when you step outside after a long time in a closed room. And from Crucible Station 9, every sensor board on the station spiked simultaneously. The power core of the Avarath, which had been operating at minimum safe output, barely registering on passive scans, went to full output in approximately 4 seconds. The power output of a 4,000-year-old alien starship at full capacity was, it turned out, a figure that the Veth Consortium had significantly underestimated in their salvage valuation. The salvage value of a functional Avarath was not the same number as the salvage value of a deconstructed Avarath. This fact would become relevant shortly. The internal gravity adjusted. Marta felt it as a slight shift, a few percentage points lighter than Conclave standard, and she recognized it as the specific calibration for a species she hadn't encountered before. Smaller than humans, perhaps, or more lightly built or evolved in a lower gravity environment. The species that had built this ship and had known it well enough to tune its gravity to their biology. And then the Avarath did something that it had not done in 4,000 years, that no boarding team in 40 centuries had seen it do, that no computational model of its behavior had predicted. It opened a door. Not a door that had been locked, a door that had not existed, a section of wall in the corridor adjacent to the thermal exchange chamber that resolved itself, with the quality of a system activating rather than a mechanism operating, into an opening. A room beyond, lit in the same warm directional light as the corridors, and in the room centered and waiting with the quality of something that had been placed there a long time ago and had been waiting to be found, was a chair. One chair. The right size for a human. Marta was still holding the valve actuator when she felt the pressure release. She registered it a half-second late, which was the half-second she had spent processing the door and the chair. And in that half-second, the thermal exchange system's pressure normalization, the restoration of full circulation through a system that had been at 60% capacity for 4 millennia, expressed itself through the access panel she had been working in as a pressure release event. A wave of exchange fluid analog and pressurized atmosphere through the open panel, contained mostly by the panel housing but not entirely, and Marta's left arm took the force of what wasn't contained. She heard it, a sound like a stick breaking sharp and brief. She registered it as significant. She registered it as a fracture, specifically in the radius, specifically at a location approximately 12 centimeters from the wrist. She registered this with the clinical detachment of someone who has spent 30 years in industrial environments where the machine does not pause because you are injured and has developed accordingly, the specific trained response of a working person. Note the injury, assess function, continue, assess. She assessed function. Her left hand, the nerve-damaged hand, the hand with the settlement-worthy incident behind it, the hand she had been using for 30 years, with a reduced sensation that she had simply incorporated into her operational baseline, could grip the actuator. She could not feel the fracture the way she should have been able to feel it. The nerve damage that had been classified as a disability on every medical form she had ever filed was not telling her to stop. She finished the procedure. She worked the valve twice more through its full range to confirm free movement. She documented the compound condition at the crack points. She closed the access panel. She radioed Piotr. "Valve's clear," she said. "Ship's up." "Marta," Piotr's voice said, and there was something in it. "Marta, every sensor on the station is going—" "I know," she said. "Check the secondary exchange lines when you get in here. The main valve's clear, but I want the downstream pipes looked at. They looked soft." "Are you—" "Piotr," she said. "The secondary lines." She sat down against the wall. She held her left arm at the angle that was comfortable, which was an angle that would later be described by the Conclave medic as indicating a radius fracture with significant displacement. The Avarath's light was warm on her face. The ship was running. She could feel it through the wall, through the floor, through the particular quality of the air. The deep, settled vibration of a system functioning as it was designed to function. The sound of a machine that is healthy and operational, and has been neither of those things for a very long time. From the Avarath's own communication system, on a Conclave standard frequency. in a language that the translation matrix on Crucible Station 9 identified as 4,000 years archaic, but structurally related to 14 modern languages. Assessment complete. Crew assignment accepted. 1. Designation: Repair Mind. Departure on your schedule. The translation took 40 seconds to process. By the time it resolved, Avarath had been standing in front of the communication terminal for 40 seconds, which was 40 seconds of being a Dasari in front of information that his mathematical intuition was telling him was significant before his language centers had the words to say why. The translation came through. He read it 3 times. Repair Mind. The ship had a word for what she was. Piotr found Marta against the wall. He came around the corner of the thermal exchange corridor in a half-run, with Dala behind him and Sen behind her, and he saw the arm first, the specific angle of it, the way she was holding it with her other hand. And he went pale in the specific way that 24-year-olds go pale when they see someone they trust injured in a way that suggests things are worse than the person seems to be treating them. "Your arm," he said. "I know," Marta said. "Pressure release caught it. It's the radius. It's not the wrist, so the hand works, and I already finished the procedure, so the timing is acceptable." "The timing is—" Piotr stopped, looked at her. "You finished the procedure." "The valve's clear," Marta said. "How's the ship?" "Marta, the ship is— every sensor on the station, the power output alone—" He stopped again, seemed to reset. "It's running. It's running at what the station's instruments are calling full capacity, and they don't actually have instruments calibrated for full capacity, so they've stopped giving numbers and just say exceeded range." "Good," Marta said. "There's a room," Dala said. She was looking at Marta with an expression that was the specific expression of someone very young, watching someone very experienced do something that clarified all at once a great deal about the relationship between experience and cost. "A room that wasn't there before and a chair and—" "I know," Marta said. "I saw it." "The ship sent a message," Sen said. He had his recording tablet in his hand and his voice had the quality of someone trying to maintain professional register over something that was affecting him significantly. He read the translation. He read it in the careful, precise voice of someone who understood that they were reading a document that was going to be in historical records for the rest of time. Assessment complete. Crew assignment accepted. 1. Designation: Repair Mind. Departure on your schedule. Marta was quiet for a moment. "Repair Mind," Piotr said, very quietly. "Get the medical kit," Marta said, "and someone radio ahead to tell Avarath I need a field splint and a few minutes before I come out to talk to him." "Marta, the bone or the ship," she said. "One of them was going to complain first. I'm fine. The ship's fine. Let's go with the ship." She leaned her head back against the wall of the Avarath. The wall was warm. The vibration through the wall was deep and steady and clear. The specific quality of a system that has been running at a fraction of its design capacity and has finally, for the first time in an interval it had not expected to survive, been able to run correctly. She knew that feeling from the other side. She had spent 14 months being a person running at a fraction of her design capacity, managing her own minimum safe output, waiting for something to change. She had found a stuck valve and she had unstuck it, and the ship was running. Piotr Field splinted her arm with a piece of conduit from her kit because she showed him the right size and angle, and then she stood up and she went out to face Avarath, and then she went to the chair. The chair was exactly the right height. Marta sat in it and thought about the species that had built this ship, who had calibrated the gravity slightly lower than human standard, and had built a chair that fit a human approximately as well as any chair she had sat in on a human station, and she wondered if they had been human-sized or human-shaped, or if it was simply that chairs, like thermal expansion and polymer chemistry, converged on certain functional truths, regardless of who was doing the engineering. She took out her diagnostic kit and opened it on the chair's armrest. The armrest was exactly the right width for this, and she was looking at the display, running a standard output red, when the Avarath systems interfaced with her kit. Not through a neural link, not through harmonic computation, through the kit's display. The ship was reading her diagnostic protocols, the specific format she used for her readouts, the shorthand she had built over 30 years, and translating its own system data into those formats. The maintenance log of the Avarath appeared on the display of a Klein Tools multimeter that she had bought at a hardware store in Warsaw for €47, formatted in the notation she had developed for her own records. The ship had learned how she read. She sat with this for a moment. The ship had had 40 years of observations, 4 decades of boarding teams using every kind of interface, and it had identified, in 3 hours of watching her work, the specific system of notation that she used to understand a machine, and it had translated itself into that notation, because it was trying to talk to her in the language she was fluent in. She thought, "This is what it feels like to be heard." She didn't say that out loud. She was Marta Voss-Okafor, and she did not say things like that out loud, and also her arm was hurting now that the adrenaline was fading, and she was aware, in a distant and manageable way, that the fracture was probably somewhat worse than she had initially assessed. She was looking at the display, and the display was showing her the maintenance status of a 4,000-year-old starship, and the display was formatted in her notation, and she thought, there is a lot of work here. The last thing she registered, before she became aware that she was listing sideways, was a value in the atmospheric display that her brain filed as oxygen content slightly elevated, good for post-exertion recovery. Ship noticed you were breathing harder than baseline and adjusted. Then she was unconscious. Darla reached her first. The Aresi were the fastest movers in a hurry of anyone on the team, and Darla had been watching for this, in the specific way that someone watches for a thing they are afraid of seeing, which is to say, she had been watching while trying to appear not to watch, and when Marta listed, she was already moving. She found Marta slumped in the chair, arm at the angle, breathing with the shallow regularity of someone whose body had made a decision about rest that their conscious mind had not been consulted on. And the Avarath's atmospheric processors were running. She could see the readout on Marta's own diagnostic kit, which was still active. A gentle, sustained adjustment to the oxygen content in the room. Not enough to be significant on its own, enough to assist. The ship noticed, Darla said when Piotr came in behind her. It noticed before we did. Piotr stood at the doorway of the room that hadn't existed 2 hours ago, looking at his supervisor unconscious, in a chair that fit her as if it had been made for her, on a ship that was 4,000 years old, and had just sent a message calling her a repair mind, and he thought, yes, of course it had noticed. It had been waiting for someone who would listen to it, and the first time someone had, it had started paying attention to that person in return. He called for the medical team. Sen walked through the ship while they waited, with his recording tablet and his professional caution, and the steadily increasing magnitude of what he was documenting. He walked through corridors that were now fully lit, past systems that were now fully operational, past 40 centuries of deferred maintenance that had never been performed because nobody had stayed long enough. He documented what Marta had done in 3 hours with a kit that fit in a backpack, and tools that she had bought on a planet that the Conclave ranked 31st in computational sophistication. He wrote, "The Terran technician appears to have communicated with the vessel through a methodology I can only describe as asking it where it hurt. I have been a structural analyst for 6 years, and I do not have a category for this." The Conclave medic who arrived with the medical team examined Marta in the chair. They had decided not to move her until she was stable, partly for her sake, and partly because the Avarath's atmospheric adjustment for her respiration was measurably beneficial, and none of them were confident they could replicate it outside the ship, and delivered the assessment to Piotr with the specific quality of someone reporting data that was surprising them as they spoke. The fracture is a complete radius fracture, with approximately 2 millimeters of displacement, the medic said. She completed, by all accounts, approximately 40 minutes of high-precision manual procedure after this fracture occurred. Human bone density is extraordinary. The fracture did not fragment, which in most species it would have. Human pain suppression under adrenaline is also unusual. She would have experienced significant pain, but the adrenaline response in humans appears to create a temporary functional suppression that most species don't have to the same degree. He paused. But the specific mechanism I cannot account for is this. The Terran subject maintained functional grip and task completion past the involuntary neural release threshold by a factor of approximately 3. Her peripheral nerve damage, which we would classify as a disability, appears to have removed the automatic self-protection response entirely. She completed the procedure on a fractured radius because her nervous system did not tell her she couldn't. Piotr looked at the medic. He thought about Marta's left hand, which she used without seeming to think about it, gripping things at angles and pressures that he'd noticed over 3 years were not quite standard. He had never asked her about it. It had seemed like the kind of thing she would have told him if she wanted him to know. She had been carrying a hearing loss in her left ear and nerve damage in her left hand for 29 years. They had been given to her by a naval engineering accident that had been quietly buried. They had been facts about her body that she had incorporated and continued. And in the specific circumstance of a fractured radius and a thermal exchange valve that needed to come free, the nerve damage had been an advantage. Her body had allowed her to finish. Marta came around while they were loading her onto the medical transport stretcher, and she looked up at the ceiling of the Avarath, the ceiling of a room the ship had made for her, in a ship that had been waiting for 4,000 years for someone to ask the right question. And she said, "Get someone to check those secondary exchange lines for corrosion. The valve's clear, but the downstream pipes looked soft." Then she let them take her. She woke up 11 days later in a Conclave medical facility with a proper cast and a Veth Consortium legal representative sitting next to her bed. The legal representative was a Dasari, like Sain-Forath. He was younger than Sain-Forath and had the specific quality of someone who had been sent to deliver a message that he had been told was routine but had begun, on the journey over, to suspect might not be. He explained the consortium's position with careful precision and no wasted words. The Avarath was under Veth Consortium salvage contract. Marta, as a Kepler Helix employee, Kepler Helix being Acquisition 7 of 19 by the Veth Consortium, had performed repairs on a vessel under consortium jurisdiction. The repair mine designation from the Avarath constituted, under Conclave maritime law, a crew assignment offer, which was a navigational contract. A navigational contract superseded a salvage claim under Conclave commercial law. However, the consortium's position was that Marta could not legally accept a navigational contract without consortium authorization, because she was their contractor. They were prepared to pay her medical bills and offer a compensation package. In exchange, they needed her to formally decline the Avarath's designation. The legal representative was careful not to say refuse. He said decline, as if it were a social invitation. Marta looked at the ceiling for a moment. "When's the arbitration?" she said. He told her. She said she would be there. He looked like he had expected more of a conversation, and she let him leave with the impression that more of a conversation was forthcoming, because she had learned a long time ago that the moment before you do something that should be terrifying is not the time to announce what you're about to do. The Conclave Commercial Arbitration Board sat in a chamber on Crucible Station 9 that was large enough to have been intimidating and was, in fact, intimidating because it had been designed for exactly that purpose. 7 board members, representing 7 species, clean white walls, a frequency in the air that made her back teeth ache. Marta arrived in her own clothes, jeans, dark blue worn through at the right knee from years of kneeling on deck plating, a sweater from Gdansk, the name of a shipyard across the chest in letters that had faded over 20 washes from red to a pale rust. Her arm in its cast, held in the sling the medical team had given her. She was carrying her Rothenberger torch. She set it on the table. She sat down. She had not prepared remarks. The Veth Consortium's legal representative, the older one, a senior advocate named Tessil Marath, who had the polished efficiency of someone who had won many arbitrations and had prepared for this one, presented the consortium's case with the precise, bloodless language of institutional authority. He cited 6 conclave statutes. He cited 3 precedents. He noted without any inflection that could be called contemptuous, but with a precision that achieved the same effect, that Marta Voss-Okafor was classified as a Terran laborer, Class 4, with a computational efficiency rating of 0.34, and that conclave navigational law had never contemplated a species of that classification level holding primary crew designation on a vessel of unknown origin, because the scenario had been, until 11 days ago, outside the range of scenarios that required contemplation. He concluded with the argument that Marta's acceptance of the designation would destabilize commercial salvage law across the Conclave, create precedent for other unclassified crew designations, and represent a structural disruption to Conclave commercial operations that the board, in its institutional responsibility, should not permit. Marta listened to all of this without expression. Then she looked at the board, and she said, "I want to make sure I understand the argument. The ship picked me. You want me to say no so the ship becomes yours, and your basis for this is that I'm ranked too low to be chosen." Tessil Marath began to say that this was an oversimplification. "I've been ranked my whole life," Marta said. Not loudly. She had never needed to be loud to make a point. She had learned that from years of being heard in very noisy engine rooms. "My pension was unranked out of existence. 40 years of work were computationally insufficient under interstellar commercial law. My employer was absorbed by the Veth Consortium, and my contract was declared non-transferable, which is a very precise way of saying that the decades I spent working didn't count. I'm aware of how the ranking system works." The room was quiet. "The Avarath was broken," Marta said. "Not cursed, not selective, not running a security protocol that required a specific harmonic code. She had a stuck valve, a valve-sealing compound that had polymerized over 4 millennia into a substance with the approximate hardness of petrified resin. I unstuck it." She paused. "I did this with acetone from a hardware store, isopropyl alcohol from a medical kit, and a torch I've owned for 15 years. I did it using chemistry I learned in a Gdansk shipyard, and patience I learned from watching my father fix things that other people gave up on. My father worked the cranes in Gdansk for 30 years. The shipyard closed and they gave him a plaque. I'm not doing this for a plaque." 3 of the 7 board members were from species whose historical records contained accounts of the Avarath. Marta could see on their faces different species, different physiognomies, but some expressions translate. The specific look of people who have been carrying a story about something for a very long time, and are now in the room where that story is resolving. "The ship called me a repair mine," she said. "I looked that up. In the 14 languages descended from the Avarath's builders, the closest translation is someone who hears what a broken thing is trying to say. I don't know if I deserve that. I know that in 30 years of work I have fixed a boiler in Gdynia that 17 engineers said couldn't be fixed, and a reactor manifold on a Class 7 freighter with a hammer and a spare coupling and 3 days of questions, and a valve assembly on a 4,000-year-old alien ship with cleaning fluid and a torch." She looked at the board. "She called me. I'm the one she called." Tessil Marath made his final argument. He was good at it. He had won many arbitrations, and this argument was the best version of the argument that could be made, and it was about legal precedent and commercial stability and the structural requirements of conclave law, and it was complete and precise and correct in the ways that complete, precise, correct arguments are correct when the person making them has not understood what the argument is about. When he finished, Marta looked at him. She looked at him for a moment in the specific way she looked at machinery when she was assessing where the problem was. She said very quietly, "I fixed a ship that 11 empires couldn't talk to in 3 hours with a kit that fits in a backpack. I want you to think very carefully about how confident you want to be that I can't find the stuck valve in your operation." The room was quiet. Tessil Marath was quiet. He was quiet in a way that was specific and total, not the silence of someone preparing a counter-argument, but the silence of someone who has just processed something that required them to revise, rapidly and completely, their model of the threat they were facing. He had been calculating political leverage and legal precedent. She had just told him that she operated in a different register. She was not threatening his legal position. She was not threatening his political standing. She was telling him that she understood systems, all systems, at a level that made her dangerous in ways that did not show up in computational rankings, and that she was, at this moment, pointing that understanding in his direction and asking him to think about what she might find. He was a Dasari. He was very good at mathematics. He did the mathematics. He had nothing else to say. The board deliberated for 4 hours, which was fast, and returned a decision that cited 3 legal arguments and 1 historical consideration that was recorded in the minutes as The weight of 4,000 years of recorded accounts of the Avarath's patient dormancy and the significance of her first voluntary crew designation in the recorded historical period. In practical terms, Marta won. Her Kepler Helix contract was voided. She was no longer a Veth Consortium contractor, which resolved the jurisdictional conflict. Her pension was not restored. The board noted that this was a matter for a different proceeding and that the arbitration panel lacked authority to address Earth-denominated contract disputes. She sat with this for a moment. Then she decided that she had known, going in, that the pension was gone, and that what she was fighting for had nothing to do with the pension, and that the absence of the pension was something she had been carrying for 14 months and had learned to carry and would simply continue to carry. Her official Conclave title entered into the registry in the archaic script of the Avarath's own linguistic inheritance, Repair Mind, First Designation, the first human to hold any crew title on a pre-conclave vessel, the first human to hold a crew title on the Avarath. She walked back to the ship. The Avarath was quiet when she boarded, the way a good engine is quiet when it is running correctly. Not silent, not dormant, but present. The kind of presence that you feel as an absence of worry, because the machinery is doing what it should, and you don't need to think about it. She could feel the ship's vibration through the soles of her shoes as she walked, the deep and steady pulse of a 4,000-year-old power core operating at design capacity for the first time in nearly 4 millennia. She went to the room. The chair was exactly where it had been, and it fit her exactly as it had before, and she sat in it and opened her diagnostic kit on the armrest. The display came on. The Avarath systems interfaced as they had before, presenting her with maintenance data in her own notation, formatted in the shorthand she had spent 30 years developing. The list was 847 items long. She had known going in that there would be a list. A ship that had been running at minimum safe output for 4,000 years, managed by its own regulatory systems with no external maintenance, had deferred maintenance across every system. The 847 items ranged from the atmospheric processor node in Corridor 7 that was running at 93% efficiency and needed recalibration, to a structural stress point in the portside electromagnetic rail mounting that had been developing since approximately Century 32 and would require significant reinforcement, to what appeared to be an entirely non-functional secondary navigation system that the ship had routed around so gracefully that it would have taken years of careful analysis to notice without the ship's own logs. 4,000 years of deferred maintenance. 4,000 years of a ship caring for itself as best it could, alone, waiting for someone who would listen. There was a boiler room in the naval base in Gdynia, where she had spent 3 weeks fixing a pump that 17 engineers said was irreparable. She had done it by asking it what was wrong and following the answer where it led. She had fixed it not because she was the most educated engineer in the building, or the most sophisticated, or the most computationally integrated, but because she had been willing to listen and had been patient enough to hear what the machine was saying, and had cared enough to keep going when it was difficult. The Avarath had been asking what was wrong for 4,000 years. Nobody had listened. She had listened. And the ship, this ancient, extraordinary thing, this artifact of a civilization that had left behind no other trace, that had built one vessel so well that it had survived 40 centuries of dormancy and 11 failed attempts at conquest and was still functionally and structurally sound, had noticed and had learned her notation and had opened a room for her and had called her Repair Mind, which was the word its builders had made for someone who heard what a broken thing was trying to say. She was 51 years old. She had a fractured radius in a cast and a hearing loss in her left ear that would never improve, and nerve damage in her left hand that had been on her medical file for 29 years. And she had no savings and no pension and no employer and a contractor's badge, with a computational efficiency rating of 0.34, and she was sitting in the one chair in the room of a ship 4,000 years old that had chosen her not as a captain or a commander or a hero, but as the person who was going to keep it running, because keeping things running was what she was. She looked at the list. All 847 items. The secondary exchange lines that she'd told Piotr to check. They were on the list. Items 3 through 9. Soft pipe material in 4 sections requiring replacement. The atmospheric processor in Corridor 7. The the portside rail mounting. 847 items between her and a ship in full working order, and a ship that had learned her notation and was presenting them to her in her own language because it wanted her to understand. Marta Voss-Okafor picked up her torch. She said, "All right then, let's start with the worst ones first." Sen's full assessment report, submitted to the Conclave Structural Antiquities Division 18 days after the Avarath's reactivation, contained the following passage, which was subsequently cited in 47 separate academic papers across 11 disciplines. The methodology employed by the repair mind represents a fundamentally different epistemological approach to mechanical systems than any currently recorded in Conclave engineering theory. Where Conclave methodology asks, "What is this system designed to do, and is it doing it?" the repair mind appears to ask, "What is this system trying to do, and what is preventing it?" The distinction is subtle, and its implications are significant. The former treats a mechanical system as an object with defined parameters. The latter treats it as an agent with intent. Whether or not one accepts the philosophical proposition embedded in this methodology, the practical results are, at this point, documented. The Avarath chose her. I find I have nothing to add to this that is not made redundant by that fact.